meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
No, remember.
Okay.
Ask you about me.
Hello and welcome to wherever the heck we are. I think what is this? Is this Canton, Texas?
Yeah, Jackson Township.
Jackson Township. Okay. Well, I'm Wild Bill. I am the host, producer, and writer of the YouTube channel Vintage Car History. So make sure you write that down and make sure you go and like and subscribe my channel. Because what I talk about on my channel is specifically the history of the motor car. As far as I'm concerned, it's not just about the machines themselves. It's about the people, it's about the places, it's about the events that created the modern automobile and the automotive industry as we understand it. And so I was asked today to come on and talk about Cleveland. I know, most people don't want to talk about Cleveland unless they're involved with rock and roll, but no, we want to talk about Cleveland. There's a very big reason why Cleveland was a serious contender for the heart of the automotive industry. When you're looking back in the turn of the 20th century, you had three cities that were very much trying to be that center, and that was Indianapolis, Cleveland, and Detroit. And unfortunately, yes, Detroit won, but it was a real tight race for a good long time. And to know why this race even happened, you got to go back even further. Let's go back into the 100 years. Back in the late 18th century, the explorers such as Lewis and Clark and etc., who were out checking out what was happening around the Great Lakes, found that this place, from all the way in New York, all the way to get lost in nowhere, is covered in iron, which is why this is called the Rust Belt. Lots of iron deposits, huge amounts of iron deposits, and more importantly, these are some very rich and good iron deposits. And by 1800, we knew that they were here. And therefore, what happened is people started to move to this area, to these little places like Cleveland and Toledo and Detroit, etc., and began to be miners. And they were building an incredible amount of ore, and they were pulling it out of the ground, and they were like, okay, we got all this iron. Well, now what are you going to do with it? You got to get this iron out of here. And so they, over a period of time, it took about 100 years before they finally got it completely done, but they created something called the St. Louis Seaway, the first of the Erie Canals. And what this did was this allowed the Great Lakes iron producers to be able to take their iron and not only ship it to other places in the Great Lakes, but to take it directly to the Atlantic, down the American seaboard, and even across to Europe. Indeed, here's a fact. You ever heard of the Vickers Company in England? Big guns? Yeah. In the 1850s, their weapons were made from American iron that was produced right here in the Great Lakes. It was important for this industry here to have not only the iron to produce it, but also you're going to need to have a place to ship it from. Guess where the biggest port facility, natural harbor, is found on the Great Lakes? Cleveland. Biggest port there is. It made sense to build this city, Cleveland, as the hub to move and centralize all of this material, all of these raw goods, and get them shipped to wherever they're going to go. But at the same time, why not make stuff here? Because there's two other things that happened in the late 19th century. They started building railroads, lots of them. And one of the things that was important about the railroads that were being made is that if you go down to West Virginia, etc., lots of coal. A lot of coal mining out there. And what does it take to make steel? You need iron and coal. you have to be able to coke your steel to be able to create it. And so by creating a rail network and also a canal network, yes, you actually had canals being dug from all the way from Wyoming to here just to bring raw material by barges. By the time you get to 1880, you have in Cleveland an incredible confluence of industry, of raw materials, and shipping ability. And you know what that's going to bring? People. Late 19th century, this region experienced one of the greatest explosions in its population immigration that has been seen anywhere in the 19th century outside of New York in this country. You had people from Mexico, you had immigrants from Africa, you had immigrants from Europe, all coming to Cleveland. Specifically, why? Because we had the industry. We were able to manufacture big stuff. They were making a lot of big stuff out of Cleveland back in the 1880s, 1890s. We're talking locomotive manufacturing. We're talking Pullman. You ever heard of Pullman rail cars? They were being made out here too. You had sewing machines. You had lathes, machining products. There was so much being done here, and this area was attracting some of the best minds that were available in the country. And then guess what happened in 1893? The whole market crashed. And this did happen, 1893, the great crash of 1893. That affected Ohio pretty significantly, because one of the reasons why that particular stock market crash happened was when the Reading and Pennsylvania Railroad went defunct. And this was also one of the railroads that was supplying the coal to Cleveland. And this was causing problems. What are we going to do? The unemployment rate in Ohio went up to over 50%. You had people rioting in the streets. You had these workers demanding something. We need something. And you know what most of them did, unfortunately, is they went to Detroit. And the reason they did was because although, Cleveland had some issues, Detroit still had the rail network connecting because the Reading, Pennsylvania, unfortunately, was the main supplier for Cleveland. And it took another several years to get that fixed. And so there was a shift in workers. Because if you're going to start a company building cars, you're going to need materials, raw materials. You're going to need to have brains. You're going to need somebody who knows what they're going to build and how they're going to build it. But then you need the hands, you need the people that are going to be able to put that vision on the road. And unfortunately, there was, during that time, a slowdown in what Cleveland had to offer in that regard. But here's where things got a little different. Cleveland started building up technology as a base. And this technology base was in several ways. Number one was electronics. Now, when you think electronics today, you think about computers. Well, you go about to 1900, 1890s, it wasn't computers. But think about the light bulb. A simple incandescent light bulb. I don't know if you're aware of this, but that light bulb is the basis of electronics today. Because if you take a light bulb with one filament, add another filament underneath it, boom, you have what's called a diode. And it was the vacuum tube technology that began to reinvigorate Cleveland, Ohio's industry. Along with this technology required metallurgy. We needed more people to take the iron and take the manganese and take the different materials that we're manufacturing, we're pulling out of the ground, and figure out how to make new products with them that will be specific to the electronics industry. And now you're probably asking, well, why am I talking about electronics with cars? Well, the answer is this: James Packard. James Packard was instrumental in the Cleveland automotive industry, even though his company moved out of Cleveland in 1904, but not because he sold it off and they moved to Detroit. But it was his work in developing and growing, and first of all, surviving the panic of 1893, but in building that technology base so that Cleveland would be known as the center of industry that is on the cutting edge. And that's what made us different as a city. And the first man to make that the standard for Cleveland was Alexander Winton. Alexander Winton began his company here. I mean, he was a Scotsman, so that already is like, okay, he's Scots. Okay? Now, if you don't know much about the background of Alexander Winton, I mean, he was born in Scotland. He was the son of an engineer, of a naval engineer. In fact, his father was a merchant marine engineer that worked on the earliest of steam engines. And Alexander Winton was all over it, grew up in it, went ahead and got into the industry himself, was working on steam engines and working on the ships, and he finally got on a ship that sailed into New York. Guess what he did? He jumped ship. He said, okay, I'm done with this. I'm going to go do something else. And he wound up going to his, he had a sister in a little town called Cleveland. Wound up in 1886 in Cleveland. And he actually started off making bicycles. Winton was first a bicycle manufacturer. He made, of course, machine tools in order to operate his, his company. Made bicycles, Winton bicycles, and it was going well. But then he went, you know what? I need to make some cars. And Alexander Winton, in 1896, founded the Winton Company in Cleveland, the first manufacturer of any significance in Cleveland. Now keep in mind, by 1900, Alexander Winton's company was the largest producer of automobiles in the United States. Cleveland got that close. And there's a number of things that Alexander Winton did in the development of the car and its organization that last to this day. I don't know if you're aware of this, but have you ever been to a car dealership? Anybody? Ever been to a car dealership? Guess who invented that? Alexander Winton. He was the first one in anywhere to come up with the idea of, hey, let's do this. Instead of me trying to sell these cars right out of the factory to whoever either shows up or orders it on, through the telegraph, I'm going to send these cars to these retailers that will be franchised. Yes, this is long before Ray Kroc and Ronald McDonald. Okay? And I'm going to sell these cars to my dealerships, and then the dealerships can deal with actually trying to sell them. Okay? As obvious as this is groundbreaking. I mean, this is 1899 he's doing this. That's not the only thing that he did. Because if you're going to sell them to your dealerships, well, you got to get your cars to your dealers. How do you do that? What are you going to do? Send them UPS? UPS didn't exist. Okay? He invented the car transport truck. The trucks that we are familiar with along the highways now that have all those big racks and you can just pile cars onto them, that's Alexander Winton. He invented it also in 1899. Another thing to keep in mind about Alexander Winton that is also really important. I got to take a look at my notes finally. Okay? Is that Winton was a sportsman, and he knew that if cars were going to be exciting and gain the trust of the people, the way to do it is to race them. Huh? Okay. Well, believe me, that had some good points and bad points, but he was the first of the American companies, well, actually second, Duryea was a little bit earlier, but he was the first to really take the racing side seriously and actually build specific cars for the purpose of racing. The idea was simple. If you put on a race and you tell the press about it, and we're talking 1898, 1899, then what happens? We're going to have a race, great. The reporters go and put it in the newspapers, and then the newspapers advertise it. I got free advertising.
And people will come.
And people will come. Yes. His first race, a major race that he organized was, of course, the Cleveland and New York race. Just to show that it could happen. But also, Winton's cars actually were the first to cross the country. Yeah, to drive from New York to California. 1900. Okay. Now, y'all here know your old cars, you own cars. Imagine taking one of your cars from New York to San Francisco. Okay. Now, keep in mind, there's a few things that don't exist in 1900. Gas stations don't exist. If you want to have fuel back in that days, you're either going to go to an apothecary or you go to a hardware store. They didn't have gas stations. Garages, no, don't have them. Oh, you need repairs? Well, any of the mechanics that are around have only worked on steam engines. They don't know how to work on this thing. The mind-numbing problems that you would get in trying to move a car like that across the country are crazy. And yet, it was Winton who first did it in his cars. His importance in Cleveland's establishment as an automotive hub cannot be underestimated. Unfortunately, his company didn't survive much past World War I. It was defunct by 1924. Various reasons about that we'll talk about in a bit, but he wasn't the only one out here. I mentioned James Packard. Okay, I'll be honest, technically he's not from Cleveland, he's from Warren, Ohio, okay, kind of like Alfred Pope, Colonel Pope, he was from Toledo, but okay. But, but the thing is that James Packard is extremely important. He's the one who he was electrical. He was manufacturing, designing, patenting so many different electronic components. And do you know how his company got started? 1898, he goes and buys himself a Winton. He goes over to the factory to go pick it up, and he drives it back home to Warren. And he gets back to it, and he's like, I am not satisfied with this. And so he writes a letter to Alexander Winton, James Packard's writing this, and says, Dear Alexander Winton, I am not completely satisfied with this automobile because I didn't find the reliability was that good. I had this problem, that problem, etc., etc., etc. And he sends that to Alexander Winton's customer service department. And Alexander Winton answered him personally and said, well, hey, sorry you had so many problems, but if you think you can do better, go right ahead. And this is why we have the Packard. The Packard was amongst the 3 Ps of some of the greatest luxury automobiles of the United States. You had Peerless, Packard, and Piercero, the 3 Ps. Now, admittedly, James himself actually retired not long after he started the company. In 1903, he retired, set aside to finish off the rest of his life in retirement, which he passed away in 1910. And the company was purchased and moved to Detroit. I'm sorry, I know we're talking about Cleveland, but he moved to Detroit. But Packard was so important in that early development, and he wasn't the only one that was important because we had more than just these gasoline cars. Let's not forget Walter Baker. Who here has heard of the Baker? Okay. The Baker electric car from 1899 all the way to 1914. The Baker car was an electric car that when it first came out was heavy with huge batteries that weighed too much, and the thing went slow and was really good if you wanted a car that you could drive for 10 miles a week because it took forever to recharge this thing. And it was just, okay, there's problems. But here's what he did. Okay, who here has heard of Camille Janotze? Okay. We go back to 1899 and we go and look at the first land world speed records. And you look at who actually was the first to exceed 100 kilometers an hour, and that was Camille Janotze in his own electric car that he had designed and rebodied to look like a torpedo, which was called the Never Content. And he set the world land speed record at 103.72 kilometers an hour. So this guy, Walter Baker, he goes, you know what? I want to do that. And so even though his car, by the Jeanette says, Never Content, made about 67 miles per hour, this guy, Walter Baker, he says, okay, I'm going to put the same kind of torpedo-looking body on this thing. I'm going to make my own car. I'm going to make it super fast, and I'm going to even beat his record. And in 1902, after testing it a few times, he goes and takes the thing to New York to do a speed run and a race, crashes it into a crowd and kills 3 people in the process. So Baker went, okay, this is a problem. So what are we going to do to help people from being killed in races? And so he said, you know what I'll do? I'm going to make bolts and straps to hold somebody in their seat on a car, and invented the seat belt. It was invented here in Cleveland. Now, there's somebody else we need to talk about. Roland White. Okay, who here's heard of the White steam car? Yeah, we've been talking about it for the last half hour. Okay. But let's not forget the importance of Roland White and what he did. Because mind you, we already talked about a couple of cars that were gas powered. We talked about an electric car. But now when you talk about White, you're talking about a steam car. Roland White's cars had a lot of innovations that were radically different from the previous ones by the likes of Leon Serpollet, of Peugeot, of Amédée Boulay, of the Stanley Brothers, or of Locomobile, which all used essentially boiler systems. Different types of boiler systems, there's a number of. You have your cold tube, you have your hot tube, you have your foul tube, there's a lot of different boiler systems. But what Roland White invented was the steam generator. This was the first high-pressure steam system that was ever used in an automobile, that was ever used in anything. It took another 40 years for that technology to even make it to navies. This was groundbreaking, invented here in Cleveland. And the thing about Roland White's cars is that they could generate steam very quickly. Instead of having to wait 15, 20, 30, 35 minutes before you can get your Stanley steamer up and rolling, a White could get up and moving a lot quicker, 10 minutes or less. It was heating a lot less water, and it was superheating it using its steam generation system. But it also overcomplicated itself. Steam engine cars typically don't even need transmissions, and yet this thing had one. I mean, a steam engine makes all of its power from rest. It's like an electric motor. You can't just start a gas engine and move. It has to get running first, and so you can build your momentum, with your balancer, flywheel, etc., to get things rolling. This is true even to this day, but not so with an electric or gas engine. So this thing could just go immediately. What do you need a transmission for? You can direct drive the thing. But that's what he did. However, his cars were very successful and were very popular. The first car to be actually used and purchased by the White House was a White, which was purchased by Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. Although he didn't actually ride in it, the first car that was actually purchased and used by a president was also a White, which was ridden in by Howard Taft. Oh yeah, you know what I'm talking about. All right, so White is very important. It's unfortunate that White did not survive building cars much past World War I. But they still were building all kinds of stuff. White made more than just steam cars. They made sewing machines. They made lathes. They made all kinds of different equipment and smaller machinery. Interestingly enough, by the time you get to World War I, that's the direction that Cleveland's industry is going, as it's starting to work away from making cars. But we don't want to forget somebody who also is important. Louis Morse. Who knows who Louis Morse is? M-O-O-R-E-S. Louis Morse. Who here has heard of Peerless? Yes. Now, this man started his company in 1900. And this is an important one. This is a very important one because Peerless was one of those 3 Ps. And unlike Packard, who was a traitor and left Cleveland and went to Detroit, Peerless stayed. And they built some of the greatest cars of the vintage era. I haven't even talked about them on my channel yet. This will be I'm filming this, so this will be the first that folks are going to hear about them. But here's the great thing about Peerless, is that here's the thing about us folks in Ohio and the folks out in Cleveland. If something ain't working, do something that does. Because Peerless did not survive the Depression. They were building high-end luxury cars. These are cars that cost $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 just for the chassis. And we're talking, in the 1920s. That's a whole lot of money. That was going to be a problem. And they ended up going, you know what, this ain't going to work. We are going to shut down. But they said, well, rather than just leave this big empty building full of nothing, let's repurpose it. And so they did. And they took out all of the machines necessary to manufacture their cars and replaced them with big vats to make beer. And so Peerless Motor Car Company exists to this day. They still exist, and they are the brewers of Carling's Ale. So when you go to Carling's and you grab yourself a pint, you're drinking automotive history. So make sure you click up through that. Now, here's what's going to be interesting: is why do we not have any major manufacturers today, in Cleveland? And the answer is actually we do. What Cleveland as a city did is shifted from building cars to building technology for cars. Now, this was actually spearheaded by Henry Timken. And putting the Timken Bearing Company here, as well as what James Packard had with his electronic company, were making the components that could make awesome cars. And then make those components better, and those components better, and continue to refine it through a mechanical and electronic engineering. And in fact, to this day, guess who is the biggest company that is the innovator of racing for the automotive industry? And it is Summit. And they are based right here. Have been since the 1960s. And they are not only the manufacturer but distributor of so many innovative racing parts to modify cars and to make what other people make better. But let's face it, if they still made them here, they'd have been made right the first place, wouldn't they? So, if you're interested in what I do, I'm Wild Bill, Vintage Car History. Jump on YouTube. Check out Vintage Car History. See what I do. Because quite frankly, I absolutely love the history of what we all love, which are these cars. Who were these people? How are these cars? How did they come around? You gotta love it, because if you forget your history, you're gonna forget what it takes to make our cars so great. So, Thanks for your time today, and see you soon. Peace.